The bar was called Labim, a fitting name for a place that seemed to exist only in the forgotten folds of the city. The air inside was a tapestry of cigar smoke and expensive, expired perfumes, a mixture that clung to the throat like a spider's web. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to disappear. The man beside me, Dante, he said, had hands that looked carved from cold marble. When he touched the counter, the ring of his gold band against the zinc echoed like a funeral bell in an empty cathedral. I lost myself in the rhythm of his voice, a baritone that vibrated in my bones, dragging me into a reverie where the bar's walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in an asthmatic wheeze, while the liquor bottles on the shelves shimmered like reptilian eyes watching my free fall into the unknown. "You're running from something," he said. It wasn't a question. His pupils were vast, black holes swallowing the dim light of the amber lamps. "We all are," I replied, my voice sounding like torn paper. I lied about my name. I invented a life of silk and thorns. But as I spoke, I had the distinct sensation that my own skin was becoming a poorly fitted suit, as if the lies I uttered were rewriting my biology under that stranger's watchful gaze. The ice in my glass cracked, the sound of a bone snapping. Dante smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. It was merely a fissure in the marble. "The dark is a spacious place, Elena," he whispered, using the real name I had never given him. Panic was a fine needle driven into the base of my skull. "How?" The bar suddenly seemed to plunge into absolute silence, a vacuum where the sound of my own heartbeat became a deafening drum, a rhythmic confession that I had just stepped beyond the edge of the real world and into a territory where shadows have teeth and time folds back on itself like a Mobius strip made of flesh and regret. "Let's get out of here," he suggested. His fingers closed around my wrist. The touch was not human. It was a temperature that does not exist on the scale of the living, a cold that burned, a promise that in crossing that frosted glass door, I would not just be leaving a bar, but abandoning the light forever. Outside, the city was wrong. The streets were too long. The streetlights bled a sickly violet onto the wet asphalt, which reflected not my face, but a hungry void. Dante opened the car door. The interior smelled of new leather and damp earth. Graveyard earth. I got in. The door lock clicked with absolute finality. "Where are we going?" I asked, watching his profile, which seemed to dissolve and recompose with every flash of light that passed through the glass. "To the place where masks can no longer cling to the face," he replied, and the car glided over the asphalt without a single sound, as if we were navigating a river of black oil toward a horizon that shouldn't exist. The silence inside the car was not the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a thick gelatinous membrane that pressed against my eardrums until they throbbed with the rhythm of things unsaid. Outside the window, the city had begun to liquefy. The familiar geometry of skyscrapers and street signs softened and ran like wax under a flame, distorting into elongated skeletal fingers that reached toward a sky the color of a bruised lung. Dante did not look at the road. He did not need to. He drove with the terrifying stillness of a statue, his hands resting on the wheel, with a grace that felt predatory, while I sat beside him, watching the shadows in the back seat grow long and tangled, weaving themselves into shapes that mimicked the silhouettes of people I used to know, voices I had buried in the basement of my mind, now scratching at the upholstery, whispering secrets about the density of the soul and the fragility of the bone. "The air is getting thin," I whispered. My breath fogged the glass, but the mist formed patterns that looked like ancient, weeping eyes. "Reality is a polite lie, Elena," he murmured, his voice sounding as if it were coming from inside my own chest. A thin veil we drape over the abyss so we can sleep without screaming. But tonight, the veil is snagged. Tonight, you're seeing the threads. The car turned a corner that felt like it spanned 1,000 miles. Suddenly, we were no longer moving through the city. We were traversing a landscape of gray plains and monolithic ruins that hummed with a low-frequency vibration, a sound that tasted like copper and old blood at the back of my tongue. I reached for the door handle, but my hand felt distant, a Paleolithic tool belonging to someone else. And when I looked down, my fingers seemed to stutter in time, trailing translucent ghosts of themselves, as if my physical form was failing to keep pace with the horrific speed of my descent. I blinked, and for a second, Dante's face was not a face at all. It was a shifting kaleidoscope of every person I had ever feared. The teacher who watched too closely, the stranger in the alley, the father I never knew. All of them shimmering beneath a layer of translucent, shimmering scales. I wanted to scream, but the air in my lungs had turned to lead, heavy and cold, anchoring me to the seat as the car pulled up to a house that stood alone in the center of the gray waste, a jagged tooth of stone and shadow that seemed to be weeping shadows from its windows. The engine died. The silence returned, sharper now. "We are here," he said. He turned to me, and his eyes were no longer black holes. They were mirrors, reflecting a version of me that was already decaying, a version of me that had never left the bar. "Where is here?" My voice was a ghost of a sound. "The place where the mask meets the bone," he replied, opening his door. As I stepped out, the ground beneath my feet felt less like earth, and more like a vast sleeping heart, pulsing with a slow, tectonic dread that suggested that if I stayed still for too long, the world would simply open its mouth and swallow me whole, leaving nothing behind but the echo of a name I could no longer quite remember how to spell. How did I get here? I followed a stranger for a drink. I followed a monster for a dream. Now, the door of the house stood open, an unblinking eye inviting me into a darkness that felt like home. The threshold of the house was not a line, but a surrender. As I stepped inside, the air changed. It became thick and stagnant, tasting of ozone and ancient dried flowers. The door behind me didn't just close, it ceased to exist, the wood merging into the wallpaper until the entry was nothing more than a memory of light. I was in a hallway that defied the eye. It stretched forward with a sickening elasticity, the walls lined with portraits whose subjects had been scrubbed away, leaving only empty silhouettes that seemed to lean toward me as I passed. "Don't look at the frames," Dante whispered. He was standing several feet ahead, yet his voice brushed against the shell of my ear, warm and devastatingly intimate. "They're hungry for a face to wear." I followed the sound of his footsteps, which made no noise on the floorboards. My own feet, however, felt heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. Every step was an act of will. I looked down and saw that the floor wasn't made of wood at all, but of tightly packed books, their spines cracked and bleeding ink that pooled around my ankles like oil. We entered a room that was both a library and a ballroom, lit by a chandelier of frozen tears. The ceiling was so high it held its own weather. Thin gray clouds drifted lazily above us, raining a fine silver dust that vanished before it touched the ground. "You invited me here," I said, my voice echoing in a way that sounded like a dozen different versions of myself speaking at once. "But you never told me who you are." Dante turned. In the shifting light of the crying chandelier, his shadow was detached from his body, pacing the perimeter of the room like a caged animal. He began to unbutton his coat, a slow, methodical movement that felt like a ritual. "I am the answer to the prayer you made when you walked into that bar," he said. He moved toward me, and the space between us seemed to collapse, the floor folding in on itself to bring him closer. "You asked for an end to the mundane. You asked to be seen, truly seen." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from him now, a pulsing solar flare of energy that made the air tremble. But beneath the heat, there was that abyssal chill, the reminder that he was a predator of souls. I should have run. I should have clawed at the walls until my fingernails broke. Instead, I leaned into the void. My heart was a frantic bird hitting the bars of its cage, but my skin was singing. It recognized him. It lusted for the undoing he promised. The room began to tilt. The books beneath my feet started to whisper, thousands of pages turning at once. A dry, papery roar that filled my head with words in a language I didn't know but understood perfectly. They were stories of people who had come before me. The lost, the lonely, the seekers of the dark. Dante's hand finally made contact, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. The touch sent a shock through my system that wasn't just physical, it was an intrusion of memory. I saw flashes of a life I hadn't lived. A crown of thorns, a throne of salt, a long walk through a forest of glass. "You aren't a man," I breathed, the realization tasting like iron. "And you," he countered, his eyes swirling with a sudden, violent gold, "are no longer a victim. You are the guest of honor at your own execution." He pulled me toward him, and for a moment, the house vanished. There was only the press of his body against mine, a solid, terrifying reality in a world of ghosts, and the feeling of his teeth grazing the sensitive skin of my neck, a promise of a pain so exquisite it would feel like a second birth. The darkness wasn't coming for me anymore. It was already inside. The embrace was a collision of tectonic plates. Dante's body felt like a monolith of heat, a singular point of gravity in a room that had finally finished dissolving. The library, the crying chandelier, the floor of bleeding books, they all fell away into a velvet abyss, leaving us suspended in a hollow space where the only landmarks were the lines of his muscles and the frantic staccato of my own pulse. He didn't just hold me. He colonized the space I occupied. "Look at me, Elena," he commanded. His voice wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical vibration that rearranged the marrow in my bones. I lifted my head, and the world fractured. In front of me stood a mirror, a tall, jagged shard of silver ice that hadn't been there a moment ago. But the reflection wasn't us. It was a distorted tapestry of could-have-beens. In the glass, I saw myself sitting alone at the bar, nursing a drink that never emptied. I saw myself walking home under a normal sky, living a life of quiet, gray desperation until the day I turned to dust. Then, the reflection shifted. I saw my skin peeling back like a ripening fruit, revealing something shimmering and iridescent beneath. I wasn't a woman of flesh and blood in the mirror. I was a creature made of starlight and ink, my eyes twin nebulae, my hands dripping with the same dark oil that paved the road to this house. "The mask is heavy, isn't it?" Dante whispered, his lips brushing against my ear. His reflection was a towering shadow, a king of ruins with a crown of smoke. "You've spent so long pretending to be fragile, pretending to be small. But you came to the abyss because you were tired of the light that didn't know how to burn." He turned me around, pressing my back against the cold surface of the mirror. The ice bit into my skin, a sharp, crystalline contrast to the searing heat of his chest. His hands found mine, pinning them against the glass. our fingers interlaced, and where our skin met, the mirror began to crack. The sound was like 1,000 windows breaking at once, a symphony of destruction. I felt a sudden, visceral expansion. The walls of my psyche, the neat little boxes where I kept my name, my past, my fears, they burst. I was the glass. I was the shadow. I was the hunger. His mouth found mine, and it wasn't a kiss. It was a reclamation. It tasted of wood smoke and old gods. It was the sensation of falling upward, a dizzying ascent into a sky that had never seen a sun. My senses were overloaded. The scent of his skin, like rain on hot stone, the sound of the house groaning as it reshaped itself around our desire, the sight of my own hands turning translucent against the silver of the mirror. I am losing myself, I gasped into the hollow of his neck. No, he growled, his grip tightening until it was almost painful, a grounding ache that kept me from drifting into nothingness. You are being found. You are the secret this house was built to keep. He lowered his head, his tongue tracing the pulse point at my throat. With every beat of my heart, the mirror behind me rippled like water. I felt his hand slide down, not with the hesitance of a lover, but with the authority of a master architect, his touch igniting fires in nerves I didn't know I possessed. The horror was no longer outside. It was the realization that I didn't want to be saved. I wanted to be consumed. I wanted him to tear away every lie until there was nothing left but the raw, screaming truth of what I was. Suddenly, the mirror shattered completely. We didn't fall. We floated in a storm of silver shards, each one reflecting a different sin, a different joy, a different death. And in the center of the storm, Dante looked at me with eyes that were no longer gold, but a terrifying, beautiful void. Show me, he whispered. Show me the monster you've been hiding under your skin. And for the first time in my life, I stopped fighting the dark. I opened my mouth, and instead of a scream, a swarm of black butterflies poured out, filling the void with the beating of 1,000 wings. The swarm was a living veil, a frantic cloud of ink-dark wings that tasted of old paper and adrenaline. I could no longer tell where my body ended and the house began. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of an approaching storm. Dante stood at the center of the chaos, his presence a dark anchor in a world that had lost its gravity. He didn't flinch as the butterflies brushed against his skin. He watched them with the pride of a sculptor watching his clay finally begin to breathe. The metamorphosis is never silent, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the silver shards still suspended around us. I reached out, but my arm felt like it was made of smoke. I watched, fascinated and horrified, as the skin of my wrist began to unravel, not into blood, but into threads of shimmering obsidian silk. I wasn't dying. I was being unmade. Every memory I held dear, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the cold sting of a winter morning, the sound of my own name, was being spun into this new, dark fabric. I felt a sudden, sharp hunger. Not for food, but for existence. Dante moved toward me, stepping through the cloud of wings. As he approached, the butterflies settled upon him, covering his shoulders like a living cloak. He took my face in his hands, and his touch was the only solid thing left in the universe. The hunger you feel, he whispered, his eyes now vast maps of constellations I didn't recognize, is the void recognizing itself. You've spent your life trying to fill it with shadows. Now, let the shadow fill you. He pulled me into him, and the sensation was like a drowning in reverse. I was being filled with the history of the house, the weight of the gray plains outside, and the cold, eternal logic of the abyss. I felt his teeth once more, sharper now, pressing against the vein in my neck, a rhythmic, predatory promise. The house let out a long tectonic groan. The walls of the room began to bleed. Not red, but a thick, luminous gold that glowed with an inner light. It dripped from the ceiling, pooling around our feet, rising until we were waist deep in a sea of molten alchemy. The heat was unbearable, a purifying fire that stripped away the last vestiges of the Elena who had walked into that bar. I clung to him, my fingers digging into the silk of his shirt, feeling the impossible strength of the ribcage beneath. I wanted to disappear into him. I wanted to be the air in his lungs and the mercury in his veins. "Is this the end?" I managed to gasp, the words feeling heavy, like stones in my mouth. "This is the threshold," he replied, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of something human in his gaze, a profound, ancient loneliness that matched my own. "Few have the courage to burn this bright, Elena. Most choose the gray. You chose the fire." He tilted my head back, and the ceiling above us simply vanished. In its place was a great eye, a swirling vortex of purple and black that looked down upon us with an indifferent cosmic hunger. The molten gold rose to our chests. The butterflies began to scream, a sound like dry leaves caught in a gale. Dante's grip tightened, his body a pillar of iron as the world began to spin, faster and faster, until the room was nothing but a blur of gold and shadow. I closed my eyes and let the black butterflies carry me toward the eye. I was no longer afraid of the dark. I was the dark. And then the floor gave way. Falling is a misnomer. It was an immersion, a slow-motion descent into a sea of liquid velvet where the laws of physics were replaced by the laws of desire. The molten gold that had filled the room now encased us, a warm, amniotic fluid that tasted of honey and copper. In this golden pressurized womb, Dante was the only thing that kept me from dissolving into pure light. His hands were everywhere, on my waist, my shoulders, tangled in my hair, holding the fragments of my consciousness together as the house, the city, and the world screamed in the distance like a fading radio station. "Don't fight the dissolution," he breathed, his mouth against mine. We didn't need air. We were breathing each other, a rhythmic exchange of essences that blurred the line between two bodies and one soul. "Give me the parts of you that you've kept locked away, the parts that scream in the middle of the night. Give them to me." The intimacy was more than physical. It was a psychic flaying. I felt his mind slide into mine, a cold, sharp blade cutting through the static of my ego. He saw the girl who hid under the stairs. He saw the woman who looked at her reflection and saw a stranger. He touched every scar, every shame, every unuttered wish, and instead of recoiling, he fed on them. He transformed my trauma into a dark, pulsing power that radiated from my skin in waves of violet heat. My body felt electric, a conductor for a current that was too vast for human nerves. As he pressed me deeper into the golden depths, a visceral, carnal hunger erupted within me. I bit his shoulder, tasting not blood, but a substance like liquid starlight, bitter, sweet, and intoxicating. The horror was the ecstasy. It was the realization that being destroyed by him was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. Every touch was a desecration of the old me and a consecration of the new. We were two predators locked in a dance of mutual consumption, a carnal ritual performed at the edge of the universe. The golden sea began to thicken, turning into a solid, pulsing crystal. We were being forged. I felt my skin harden into something indestructible, yet supple as silk. My senses expanded until I could hear the stars grinding against each other in the void, and feel the slow, heavy heartbeat of the house miles above us. "You are becoming," he whispered, his eyes now twin suns burning with an impossible, dark radiance. "You are the bride of the abyss, Elena, my equal in the hollow places." He arched his back, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain, a blooming flower of agony in the center of my chest. It was the feeling of a second heart starting to beat, a heart that didn't pump blood, but shadow. The pleasure that followed was a tidal wave, a cataclysmic release that shattered the crystal cocoon. We were no longer falling. We were rising, a twin pillar of smoke and fire, tearing through the layers of reality like a bullet through silk. I looked at my hands. They were no longer smoke. They were obsidian, tipped with claws of diamond, glowing with a soft internal light. Dante smiled, and for the first time, I saw the true shape of him, a towering, multifaceted god of the interstitial spaces, a creature of wings and eyes and infinite hunger. And I realized, with a jolt of terrifying joy, that I looked exactly like him. The ceiling of the library rushed back toward us, the books, the crying chandelier, the dust. But they were small now, insignificant. We landed on the floor of cracked spines with the weight of falling stars. The house trembled, its foundations groaning in submission to its new masters. "The night is just beginning," Dante said, his voice a thunderclap that shook the very air. I stood up, my new heart beating in perfect synchronization with his. I looked toward the door, the one that had ceased to exist, and with a single thought, I made it reappear. But it didn't lead back to the bar. It led to the world I was going to remake in our image. The door did not creak. It exhaled. I stood upon the threshold, the obsidian of my skin cooling as it met the air of a world that no longer fit me. Beside me, Dante was a pillar of quiet cataclysm, his presence folding the space around him like heavy velvet. We were back, yet we were nowhere. The bar, Labim, sat at the end of a street that now resembled a charcoal drawing left out in the rain, smudged, fragile, and utterly inconsequential. "They are waiting," Dante murmured. I looked down at the city. From this height, the lights of the cars and the glow of the apartments looked like embers in a dying fire. Millions of people, huddled inside their polite lies, oblivious to the fact that the veil had not just snagged, it had been shredded. I stepped onto the pavement, and the asphalt ripples beneath my feet like the surface of a dark pond. I felt the collective pulse of the city, a frantic, shallow vibration of fear and boredom. It was a banquet laid out for a hunger that had no bottom. "What am I now?" I asked, my voice no longer a sound, but a command that made the shadows at my feet sit up and listen. Dante reached out, his hand tracing the curve of my new diamond-tipped claws. "You are the crack in the glass, the ghost in the machine. You are the reason they check under their beds and pray to gods who stopped listening eons ago." He leaned in, his breath cold as a winter moon against my neck. "You are the night, Elena. And the night is always hungry." We walked toward the bar, but as we approached, the building began to shiver. The glass windows cracked in spiderweb patterns, reflecting 1,000 versions of our new, terrible beauty. I saw the girl I'd been, the one who wanted to disappear, and I watched as her reflection dissolved into a swarm of black butterflies that took flight, darkening the violet sky. I reached for the handle of the bar door. It wasn't metal. It felt like bone. Inside, the music was still playing, a distorted, warped version of the jazz from before. The patrons were frozen, statues of flesh caught in mid-laugh, mid-drink, mid-lie. They were gray, drained of color, mere sketches in a world that had lost its ink. I walked to the counter, to the exact stool where I'd sat. I picked up the glass of whiskey I'd left behind. The liquid was now a swirling vortex of starlight. I drank it, and I felt the last anchor to my humanity snap. "The cycle begins again," Dante said, taking his place beside me. The door of the bar opened. A man walked in, tired, his tie loosened, eyes searching for an escape from a life that felt like a cage. He looked at the bar, blinking against the dim, amber light. He didn't see the monsters. He saw a beautiful woman with eyes like nebulae, and a man who looked like he owned the secrets of the earth. He sat down 2 stools away. He looked at me, a tentative, desperate smile forming on his lips. "Tough night?" he asked. I turned to him, my smile a fissure in the marble of my face, my teeth white and sharp as stars. Beside me, Dante's shadow grew long, reaching out to touch the man's reflection in the mirror. "The night hasn't even started," I whispered. Outside, the city finally began to scream, a sound of beautiful, rhythmic terror, as the shadows moved from the corners of the rooms and into the hearts of the sleepers. The Labim sign flickered once, twice, and then stayed dark. The abyss hadn't just looked back. It had walked through the door, and it was thirsty for a second round. If you enjoyed this glimpse into the shadows, subscribe to Velvet Vices for more forbidden stories. Don't let the fire fade out.